you understand how fucking much of a nightmare it was making this list?
Do you understand how much I don't care because it took you 3 weeks to make the list?
Well, I'm sorry. I had goddamn 60 albums to go through.
Well, you didn't need to go through all of them. You just needed to go through, like, the important ones.
That's hard to... When I sat down to make this list, I thought to myself, their career is split into eras. And I was like, I should try to at least pull one song from each era. But some of those eras fucking suck. And it was pretty difficult to find a song from that era. And there's a couple eras I just said, fuck it. They're not getting any representation because they don't matter.
Well, today we're going over the top, or I'm not, because Jonathan's doing this. This is 10 songs he selected to get you into the experimental collective known as The Residents.
The Residents. Who are the Residents? Fuck if I know. Fuck if anyone knows.
So they are an anonymous collective.
I had to set so many goddamn rules for myself just to try to narrow down what I was going to be picking from. So I had to decide I could only pick from things that they released as The Residents, which means I couldn't do the Delta Nudes or the Uggs albums. I couldn't do their early Warner Bros. Album because they didn't even have a name back then. That's actually how they got their name. When they sent the tape to Warner Brothers and Warner Brothers basically replied, "If the fuck is this shit?" They sent it back to The Residents because they didn't put names on them for who they sent it back. So they just put The Residents of the address they were sending it back to. And they said, yep, that's our name now, fuck it. This list was a nightmare to make.
Okay, well, if it was a nightmare to make, maybe if we go track by track, we'll make it a little bit easier on you.
Number 1, Satisfaction, a cover. Reason I picked this one is because The Residents do a fuck ton of covers. They have I think 3 full covers albums and a shit ton of singles that are covers. And they might technically have a 4th cover album. I'll get to that later. And Satisfaction was the cover that kind of made them big and got the world into The Residents for a little while. And it's just a weird fucking take on a song that already had a different weird take on it with Devo. Instead of doing what you would normally expect from this, which is where Devo did it, where they kind of still emphasized the vocals and just changed the instrumentation, The Residents down-tuned the vocals in this horrifying guttural growl that's barely understandable and just kind of deeply unpleasant to listen to, as is a lot of their music. It's purposely designed to be irritating or just grating onto the ear. And since it's such a well-known track by such a well-known band, Rolling Stones, it's kind of just a good intro point to the band. Not only because, like I said, it's the first one that really helped them blow up, but because it's showcasing what they do well, which is kind of a deconstruction of music itself. So you can compare it to the traditionally made rock song, which has a old school pop rock styling to it, and just kind of see how it is The Residents goes about making music, which is just taking what's pop or popular or just traditional music structuring and kind of just completely, utterly destroying everything that makes it considered to be listenable. Number 2, Constantinople, probably The Residents' most well-known track. Constantinople comes from The Residents' 2 EP combination album, Duck Stab. This is kind of their biggest album, and it still is their most popular album to date. Duck Stab itself as an album, I could have pretty much made the list off of this. The album's the perfect album to use to try to get yourself into The Residents. It covers such a wide basis of the sounds that they've employed or explored over their career that it's kind of a singular point to just kind of get a brief overview of everything you're going to hear if you try to dive into their ungodly large discography. And Constantinople off of it is probably one of their funnest and somewhat more accessible songs. It's weird, it's bizarre, it's a little annoying, but it's still pretty close enough to traditional music that it's kind of accessible from an outsider standpoint. Number 3, Die, 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 off of their latest album, Metal, Meat, and Bone. This album is maybe a covers album because The Residents present it as them covering the music of Dying Dog. However, Dying Dog has no real recorded history outside of what The Residents themselves have presented. I spent a week straight when this album came out trying to find any information to back up that Dying Dog was not created by The Residents as a fake person for them to cover. And the only thing I found is one singular blog post from one guy who never posted anything else anywhere else on the internet. So I'm personally convinced that Dying Dog is probably not real, even though he has music that the residents themselves released on behalf of the no longer around Dying Dog. This album was the residents' attempt to go into blues, a genre they said has always fascinated them, but something they were never able to find a solid enough concept to make an album out of until recently, when they discovered the music of Dying Dog and decided to cover it. The album itself is one of their best albums in a long time, definitely a highlight of the second half of their career, where a lot of their music kind of started getting same and pretty formulaic, which is odd for a band who existed to tear apart formulas themselves. Within it, you kind of get a weird alternate history where if instead of tackling pop music, they wanted to tackle blues, as a lot of the other experimental bands of the time, like Frank Zappa, Mothers of Invention, and Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band, focused on. It's an interesting kind of brief look into that alternate history of the residents. And while it's a great album, I think them choosing to go for pop was definitely the more interesting take and the better take. It's still an interesting look at an alternate world for the residents.
Number 4 and 5.
Smelly Tons / Torniquet of Roses. Smelly Tons, along with the follow-up song to this one, Torniquet of Roses, from their album Fingerprince, present the residents at their most technically experimental, kind of going a route that like Captain Beefheart was, where it was less about sound experimentation than it was technical experimentation, trying to push sound structuring and music structuring to a more technically complicated level, to where it wasn't just weird to listen to, it was also very difficult to play and like structurally process. Smelly Tons and Torniquet of Roses, those two work together really well in kind of exploring that brief aspect of their musical abilities that they explored early on in their career before they really set on the sounds that would define them for the rest of their time. Number 6, Ghost Child. This was the main album that you should listen to from the residents post Our Finest Flowers period. That kind of marked the end of the first half of their career and the beginning of their second half. During that time, the residents started getting really formulaic with their sound because they were exploring things outside of music to go alongside the music. That's when they started really getting into mixed media and early CGI and computer CD-ROM stuff. And so the music, while still their main focus, stopped being as experimental and unique as it used to be, and it kind of started falling into these formulas while they were working on things outside of the music. However, during that time, they released the album Demons Dance Alone, which, while still using a lot of the elements of their formula, took a notably more atmospheric and subdued and quieter route. The whole album itself is more haunting and more emotionally driven than most of their albums. It's not based on this loud, distorted version of pop sensibilities. It's more based on this growing story and this growing idea of this kind of haunted world and this more haunted atmosphere. And as such, the music is slowed down and it's a more chill listen, but still it hits you differently because of that. It hits you in a more emotional way than most of their music does. And it's a great highlight from a point in their career that was sorely missing great highlights. Number 7, this is when we start getting into albums that were kind of hard to pick songs from. This is a time when their albums were based on these huge overarching concepts, and as such, trying to pick a singular track to represent that album is much more difficult. Hard and Tenderly is from their album God and Free Persons, which is a rock, opera, midnight movie homage album. The whole thing tells a complicated story about a guy who discovers these two Siamese twins who have godlike powers. The album itself needs to be kind of taken in as a whole in order to get the full experience of it, the full kind of country twanged rock opera that they're going for. However, Hard and Tenderly has a great example of a lot of the sounds going through it, from the chorus that is used to represent the narration of the album, the people who are kind of just narrating what's happening, as well as the super twangy, almost parodying country vocalization of Mr. X, who's the lead character. And so it's a great album to listen to, but it's just kind of hard to represent just with one full song. Hard and Tenderly is probably the best you're going to get, but definitely, if you enjoy the sound of it, give the full album a listen to. Number 8, The Ultimate Disaster, from the first part of the Mole trilogy, which was an incomplete trilogy that was supposed to have 6 parts. The first 2 albums were made, and then the 4th album was made. There is no 3rd, 5th, or 6th album. The Mole trilogy was originally meant to be conceived where each part of the trilogy consisted of 2 albums. The first album and each part would tell the story of the Mole trilogy, and then the second album would explore purely the musical aspects of the culture at the time. So the trilogy was supposed to be this like grand overarching tale of one society getting destroyed and having to move in with another society, and the conflict between them and how they evolved together and how their cultures combined, and that would be explored through the second parts of that trilogies, which would be the music. So the first part would be the story, the second part would be showcasing the 2 cultures' music and then how those musics combined together and evolved with each other. So you have the first story and the first bit of music, and then the second bit of music, but not the second one story, and neither of the music nor the story of the third part. Basically what happened was the first 2 parts were a fucking monetary disaster. Nobody bought them, and the tour that they went on it was also a disaster, and the band almost broke up, so they just kind of abandoned the trilogy, and then just kind of later wanted to explore the musical aspect that they were planning on doing later. So they just kind of made that album really quick and released it, and didn't bother to make the story for the second part. A shame though, because the ideas that they're presenting on this album are great, but it just didn't work out, and so we have this completely unfinished idea, which, while unfinished, is still a great listen. The story presented in the first part is pretty cohesive. It has its own ending that would then like evolve into later, so like it doesn't feel as incomplete as it could, and definitely probably should. It still feels like a completed first part of an idea, and it has enough of an ending to not leave you pissed off at the lack of resolution. That being said, the songs on that album tend to be pretty long. This is the longest one on the playlist at 8 minutes 54 seconds, but this is also one of the more complicated songs on the piece. It tells of the destruction of the Mole people's society. So it starts with like a rainy type of instrumental, and then it kind of becomes this bombastic, chaotic destruction of sounds and chanting. This is the second song on there, the first song kind of being a weird experimental like news clipping idea where like people are talking about the storm that ended up flooding their homes, and so that's just kind of like a brief interlude before like the actual meat of the album begins. This is the first meaty song of the album, so that way you can kind of get into this idea, get into the musical concepts that are going to be presented at you, where the Mole people have this kind of dark, more world music inspired, where it's like super like down-tuned and drum based and polyrhythmic bass, whereas then the other society was going to be more of a jazz influenced musical thing, and just kind of how those 2 music ideas clash as the album goes forward. Number 9, Artic Hysteria. This was the Residents' most ambitious concept, also one of the hardest to get across, especially given that they didn't have any lyrics on this album. The idea behind this was that while the Residents were getting really into researching world music, and they were trying to just learn about music from other cultures to kind of draw from that for an album, they discovered that they couldn't find anything truly about Inuit culture. They went to research and they couldn't find any actual recordings of their music. They couldn't find any real information about their lives and how they lived. All they could find were fake Hollywood corporatized movies and ideas based on their culture, and nothing actually concrete, nothing that was truly about them. And so then they got the idea for the album Eskimo, where they would create these kind of purposely stereotypical soundscapes about their culture, but whenever the people would chant, instead of chanting anything that was actually an Inuit language, they would chant corporate slogans, corporate jingles, and things like that. Nothing that was substantial, nothing that was real, to kind of reflect how this culture that we already destroyed, basically, we're continuing to destroy by refusing to give it a voice and just kind of corporatizing it for people to sell and benefit off of. It's a good idea, and they executed it pretty well. It's considered one of the most important albums they ever made. It's questionable, ethically speaking, if that was, a great idea, because they were technically also profiting off of their culture, even though they were trying to bring attention to the fact that they had no idea what their culture actually was because it's not being recorded and it's not being shown to people. I think the message of the album was definitely hurt when they then remastered this as Eskimo with a disco bass soundscape, where they kind of just remixed everything in the style of disco. Kind of really hurt their own message a little bit, but I think the initial idea had at least like the heart in the right place and a decent idea. The end result is borderline on ambient music, something that they don't really ever touch on again. The album helped push them into their initial brief moment in the new wave music spotlight, which died right around when they attempted to make the Mole trilogy. The track Artic Hysteria is kind of the best example of all of the ambient elements that they use. They use a lot of different things for each different track. Artic Hysteria kind of has the best mix of all of the elements that they would use. It's where their corporate chanting is most apparent. It's where the wind sound that they use a lot of is like best handled. It's just a good example of kind of the mix of ideas that they were going to be using while making the ambient sounds.
And finally, number 10.
Kick a Picnic from Our Finest Flowers. Our Finest Flowers was the Residents' first example of how they would do greatest hits albums, by which I mean they wouldn't. Our Finest Flowers was made by them going back to all of their previously made albums, taking samples from those albums and mixing them together and creating entirely new sounds purely out of the samples and then with new vocals. That was how they decided they were going to do a greatest hits album. They would explore their greatest hits again with We Are the Residents, where this time instead of them making the samples, they would let other people make covers of their songs, and then they would sample those covers and then do new vocals over them. So they've never really had an official covers compilation album. They've always just ended eras of their music, these long-term halves of their careers, with kind of sampled look backs upon everything they've done before. Our Finest Flowers kind of represents the end of their first half, where all of their best music was being made, where they were being really consistent with their albums and their quality. And then after Our Finest Flowers is kind of where they started falling into their formulas a little bit, being less noteworthy as a band. Kick a Picnic is a great example of Our Finest Flowers. It's a great kind of example of the sounds that you weren't going to be hearing again after this point. It's more experimental, it's more structurally complicated, it doesn't use a lot of the formula stuff that they were going to be using later on. And so as a list to kind of get you into the Residents, it makes sense to end of Our Finest Flowers, because if you're just going to go album by album, that's where it kind of dies off, and where trying to get through the rest of their albums becomes more of a chore, because it kind of starts getting to the point where it feels like they weren't putting as much time into their music, they weren't putting as much thought into their music anymore as they used to, and it kind of makes you yourself not put as much time into their music. But it's still a great compilation album. It's a great example of a band who refused to follow musical norms, trying to do their version of a greatest hits album.
And that is it for this list. I want to thank Jonathan for writing and being so thoughtful with his observations for each track. And till next time, guys, see you, boyos.
God is gay.
I hate you.